This city should not exist, not because it lacked ambition, but because it lacked almost everything a city actually needs to survive. No water, no shade, no reason for tens of thousands of people to stop in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And yet, in 1931, right when America was hitting rock bottom in the Great Depression, something happened here. Not one, but three things almost simultaneously turned a tiny railroad stop in Nevada into something no other city on Earth has ever quite managed to replicate. I'm Dave, and today we're going back to Las Vegas, 1931. Back to when this city was still a desert town of about 5,000 people that was about to become something else entirely. Here's the context, and I'll keep it fast. By 1931, unemployment in the United States had already crossed 15%. It was heading toward 25. That's not an abstract statistic. That's 1 in 4 working-age men with nothing to do in the morning. Families losing houses. Men riding freight trains across the country just looking for a day's work. Nevada's response to all of this was, honestly, pretty pragmatic. In March 1931, the state legalized gambling. Not because it was especially progressive, because it needed the tax revenue, and it knew people were going to gamble anyway. Simple as that. But that same year, something far bigger was already in motion just outside Las Vegas. The federal government had approved the construction of what would become one of the largest engineering projects in American history, right there in Black Canyon, about 30 miles away. And that project was going to pull thousands of desperate men straight through Las Vegas's front door.
Careful it doesn't tear in the...
But here's what most people don't fully appreciate: what those men were actually walking into. Because what happened at that construction site wasn't just hard work. It was something else. Picture Black Canyon in the summer of 1931. The Colorado River running through a narrow gorge. Walls of rock rising hundreds of feet on both sides. And the temperature outside, it could hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the diversion tunnels, where men were drilling and blasting to redirect the river, it was worse. Hotter, no airflow, thick with dynamite smoke and silica dust. Now, and this is important, people came anyway, voluntarily, in large numbers. Because here's the thing. In 1931, the dam was paying $4 to $6 a day. That doesn't sound like much, but in the middle of the Great Depression, where millions of people had nothing, that was real money, steady money. The kind of paycheck that let you send something home to your family. At peak construction, the site employed over 5,000 workers daily. They came from Oklahoma, Texas, California, from everywhere America was collapsing. Some brought their families. Boulder City, a planned company town built near the site, grew from nothing to several thousand residents almost overnight. But this is where it gets complicated. And I think the complications are actually more interesting than the simple heroic workers version. The job that captured the public imagination most was the high scalers. Imagine being roped off the edge of a cliff face, hundreds of feet up with wind and loose rock above you, and spending your shift drilling and prying away unstable sections of the canyon wall so they wouldn't fall on the workers below, day after day. Workers improvised early head protection, coating their claw hats with tar and canvas, which became one of the earliest precursors to the modern hard hat. Not because management required it, because they wanted to survive. And the silica dust in those tunnels, workers knew it was bad. The company called many of the resulting deaths pneumonia on the official records. Researchers decades later would dispute that framing significantly. The official death count directly attributed to construction, 96. The actual human cost, when you factor in occupational illness, was almost certainly higher. Now, here's the balance. In 1931, compared to what much of the country was experiencing, this job was still a lifeline, which is exactly what makes it complicated. It wasn't purely exploitation, and it wasn't purely opportunity. It was both at the same time, And the men who showed up understood that trade-off. In fact, in August 1931, workers staged a strike over conditions and wages. It was broken quickly. The Depression meant replacements were waiting at the gate, but it happened. These were not passive victims. They pushed back when they could. What I want you to hold on to from all of this isn't the record-setting concrete volume or the engineering feat, though those are real. It's something simpler. After 10 hours in that canyon, the heat, the dust, the noise, the weight of what you just spent your day doing, what do you want that evening? You want to feel like a person again. You want noise that isn't blasting, light that isn't the sun baking you, maybe a drink, maybe a table with other people around it, maybe a chance, even a small, irrational chance, that tonight something good happens. Las Vegas figured that out fast. But here's what's interesting. The workers weren't even the whole story, because Nevada had quietly become a destination for a completely different kind of people too. Let's talk about something that doesn't come up enough in the Las Vegas origin story. In the early 1930s, Nevada had the most lenient divorce laws in the country. Most states required lengthy residency, expensive legal proceedings, and often proof of specific legal grounds. In Nevada, you needed 6 weeks of residency. That's it. And this created something genuinely strange, the divorce ranch. Mostly centered around Reno and northern Nevada, but extending the state's reputation statewide, guest ranches began marketing themselves specifically to people waiting out their 6 weeks, mostly wealthy women from the East Coast. They'd ride horses, enjoy the scenery, socialize with other women in the same situation, and at the end of 6 weeks, walk into a courtroom and walk out legally free. The divorce ranches were mostly a northern Nevada phenomenon, but they fed a broader image of the state as somewhere you came to shed what wasn't working: your marriage, your past, your reputation elsewhere. Las Vegas absorbed that reputation and extended it in its own direction. So by the early 1930s, you had 3 overlapping streams of people moving through this small desert city. Construction workers with cash and a need to decompress. People in legal and personal transition looking for a place that didn't ask questions. And opportunists, gamblers, business people, promoters, who could smell a market forming. Las Vegas wasn't planned. It was accumulated. Each group made it slightly more useful to the next. And the place where all this actually converged, where the money changed hands and the city started to feel like a city, was one street. Fremont Street wasn't much to look at in 1931. Low buildings, dust, a few neon signs just began to go up. Not the light show it would eventually become, just the first hints of it. But it was the first paved street in Las Vegas, which meant it was ready for traffic long before most of the city was. When gambling was legalized in March 1931, the casinos that opened along Fremont weren't the grand palaces that came later. They were small, practical, and in some cases kind of rough. But they worked. And the reason they worked is worth paying attention to. Here's what a casino in 1931 did, structurally, that a saloon or a movie theater didn't do. No windows. Once you walked in, you couldn't tell if it was 2 in the afternoon or 2 in the morning. The lighting was constant, bright enough to see clearly, designed to feel the same at any hour. The noise was continuous. Chips, voices, the mechanical sound of games. And critically, you weren't spending money, you were spending chips. You'd already made the transaction at the door. What was in your hands didn't feel the same as cash. These aren't accusations. They're design decisions. Casinos figured out, before behavioral economics had a name, that the environment you're in shapes the decisions you make. Remove the cues that tell you it's time to leave. Darkness, quiet, hunger, and people stay longer. Compare that to Boulder City, the federally planned town built for dam workers nearby. Alcohol restricted, gambling prohibited, everything orderly and regulated. Great intentions. But it wasn't giving people what they actually wanted after a shift in that canyon. The man who walks into a Fremont Street casino after 10 hours of drilling isn't making a rational financial decision. He knows the odds aren't in his favor, but he's buying something real. 2 or 3 hours where he's not thinking about the cliff face, the dust, or what happens when the project ends. That's worth something. Casinos understood that. Boulder City didn't. Now, all of this raises the obvious question. The dam was always going to finish. The workers were always going to leave. So why didn't Las Vegas just die? September 1935. Franklin Roosevelt dedicates Hoover Dam in front of a crowd of thousands. The project is officially complete. In the years it was under construction, Las Vegas's population had jumped from roughly 5,000 people to somewhere around 25,000. Entire neighborhoods had been built. Businesses had opened. The city had grown into itself. And now the main reason for all of that was gone. History is full of boom towns that collapsed the moment the boom ended. Mining camps, railroad towns, oil fields. You've probably heard of them. They grow fast and they die fast. And by every standard pattern, Las Vegas should have been next. Here's why it wasn't. The dam left something behind that most construction projects don't. Permanent infrastructure. And not just any infrastructure. They are the two most fundamental things a city in the desert needs to survive. Water. The formation of Lake Mead gave the region a reliable water supply that simply hadn't existed before. For a city in one of the driest places in North America, this was not a minor footnote. It was existential. Electricity. Hoover Dam's turbines began generating power at a scale that changed what was physically possible in this part of the country. And for Las Vegas specifically, this had one concrete, visible consequence that would define the city's entire identity going forward. You could run lights all night. Not just a few lights. All the lights. The neon signs on Fremont Street that were just beginning to appear in the early 1930s, the dam made it economically viable to run them 24 hours a day. The casinos that needed to convince people it was always a good time to be inside. Cheap, reliable power made the whole illusion sustainable. Las Vegas didn't just survive the end of Hoover Dam. The dam gave it the tools to become what it was actually trying to become. A city that never had to close. And that brings us to the real question, which isn't how Las Vegas survived, but why it succeeded when so many other places with gambling or cheap land or desperate workers didn't. Vegas didn't win because it was inevitable. It won because it stood at the crossroads of a national crisis and an unprecedented surge of infrastructure. Workers needed to forget the dust of the canyon. People in transition needed a place that didn't ask for their history. And Hoover Dam provided the water and the megawatts to turn those human needs into an illuminated empire. This city should not exist, but it does. And while 1931 was about survival and the birth of a neon identity, it was only the prologue. The infrastructure was set, the lights were on, and a new kind of power was about to move in. One that would trade construction helmets for tailored suits and desert dust for cold, organized ambition. Vegas took the bet. Vegas won. But the stakes were about to get much higher than anyone on Fremont Street could have ever imagined. However, that's a story for another journey. Until next time.